There we go. I had to go live first, I guess. Check. Make sure Hello, everyone. Welcome to CraftQuest on Call. I'm Ryan Ireland, the person responsible for CraftQuest, I guess. And I'm here today, as always, with Andrew Welch, the I didn't prepare any names for you, Andrew. So we'll just call you again the sire of SEO, the king of.
Doesn't that imply that I gave birth to SEO, though? If I'm the sire of SEO? I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with that, Ryan.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's all I got.
Okay.
How are you?
It's all right. I mean, like you said, there's no time like the present to get started. I think that was a something that was mentioned to me with much anger and derision earlier today. Yeah.
So if you're joining us live, we are watching the chat, and I think this may be hopefully a chat-heavy live stream, since we're going to talk about learning today. Some kind of share our Andrew and my experiences learning new things, and hear about things that you've done to learn new things. Whoop, sorry about that.
Whoa!
We're in the middle of a thunderstorm.
That's the best sound effect reel I've ever heard. You got that on your little... Can you hit that again? Is that like a laugh track kind of thing?
No, that's the real deal Holyfield right there.
That was freaking awesome.
Yeah.
I love it.
Anyway, what was I saying before?
I don't know, but Ryan, that reminds me. So for what you do for a living in terms of making learning materials for people, I feel like you're kind of like Lewis and Clark. I don't know if you're Lewis or you're Clark. I don't know which one you are, but you're one of those. You know what I mean? Where what you do is you go out and you start exploring, and then you find some cool stuff, and then you bring it back, and then you tell people about the cool stuff that you found. Right? So because it's not like you're born knowing all this stuff. So you, of all people, have to do a whole lot of learning, right? I mean, otherwise you literally couldn't produce the content you have. It's not like you were born with all the knowledge that's on all the videos that are up there, right? Are you
exactly the opposite. In fact, there is a ton of learning that goes into teaching something, because it's not that I can, write a module or something. You actually have to figure out how the best way is to do it, but then also poke into some of the far corners so you understand things, so you can explain them clearly. So yeah, there's a ton of learning. So yeah, that is my job. But also you write a lot of articles, and you're always kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit. And we're going to talk about in a little bit your roll-up, your foray into a roll-up plugin as well.
Who knew I would end up there? I mean, right? It reminds me of, I go on hikes every day just as a little exercise, get outside, do that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it kind of reminds me of that too, right? To go along with the Lewis and Clark analogy, in that it's really easy to go hiking on a trail if other people have already hiked on it. You know, you've got this nice little path, and you're not going to be going through prickers, and it's been cleared and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's kind of what it's like when I'm looking at when someone else has done something that I'm looking to do. Mm-hmm. I kind of check out their stuff, and I see, how did they do it, and what can I learn from that? Because doing something a lot of times is just making tons of mistakes. I mean, like when you find the right way to do something, it just means that you've made tons of mistakes along the way, and then you figured out, okay, this is probably a good way to do this thing.
Right.
And when you're learning from somebody else, you don't have to make all those annoying mistakes. Like, presumably they've made a number of them for you, and you can just kind of learn from that. So I think that's where it can be kind of useful.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes right into some stuff that I prepared. I actually prepared, Andrew, for this live stream.
That's shocking.
I'm not sure that's anything that you're familiar with in terms of the live stream.
Wow. Wow.
But anyway, so before you and I kind of start going down our own individual rabbit holes of learning, for people that are watching, if you want to chime in, because this isn't just about like, I want to learn, the German language, or I want to learn a whole new thing. Although there is some of that. We also want to tie this into learning the domain that we're already in, and pushing ourselves to learn more. So as an example, for the last few months, I've been focusing on putting out courses on CraftQuest that are about extending craft. So there's some that Ben Croker has done. I've been doing some on modules and working with events and creating, working in Twig, extending Twig with a filter. And the idea is to help people take that next step from doing the implementation work with Twig, and if they come into a situation where they need to customize something, that they have that first step to get there. But sometimes that can be kind of, daunting, especially if maybe you don't write a ton of PHP or you've never extended craft before. So I want to make sure we tie that into there, and it kind of dovetails into a little bit of what I want to cover before we get started. So back about, I'm trying to think. So this was like early Ruby on Rails days. So what, 2007, 2006. Let me just share my desktop real quick. Can you see that slide, Andrew?
I see the hero's journey.
This
reminds me of right, Joseph Campbell. You make fun of me for not reading books, but back in the day when I did read books, I read a ton of Joseph Campbell, so I'm very familiar with the hero's journey.
The hero's journey, right? So this is it's a very common storytelling structure. It's made up of 17 stages. It's really meant to span 3 acts, and it's pretty classic stuff. We're not actually going to get into it a ton, but I want to steal and really simplify this as a metaphor for learning technical topics. And in fact, when I was writing a technical book with the Pragmatic Programmers, one of their author onboarding document talked about the hero's journey. They said basically, when you're teaching someone a technical topic, you are taking them on a journey. They are the hero, and you need to be a good narrator or a good storyteller and guide them the entire way so they know what's going on. Because the hero's journey, it has its ups and downs. At the top we have, the call to adventure, and it gets, they move from the known into the unknown. And if you've ever gotten into a project, working with craft or any web technology, that line where you cross over from like, oh, I got this, to, okay, now I'm like a little bit out of like my depth here. I'm starting to get into like the learning new stuff area. And that's what we want to talk about today, is like everything below that line. But the idea here is that the whole thing is a journey. And so when you're sitting down to even troubleshoot something or debug something or write a plugin or extend craft for the first time or extend craft in a different way, as you go through this journey, this circle, the part below the known line down into the abyss, where it's the death and the rebirth, hopefully not so drastic when you're writing a plugin. But what comes out of that is your transformation, which then you are able to then take and then apply to future stuff. So,
and Andrea says she spent a lot of time in the abyss. And Ryan, I think this is hilarious because we didn't coordinate on this at all. Mm-hmm. And I started out talking about Lewis and Clark and hiking, and then you got a picture of a hiker up there that's pretty cool. That's
there you go.
Cool.
All right, so let's see.
But I want to add something though. So you're talking about this known and unknown thing, mm-hmm. and that's something that we have talked about before, and I've also talked about it. We did a show on Dev Mode about this. I think some people, you have to live on that line, really. You have to know that part of your job is not knowing stuff, or actually a big part of your job is not knowing stuff and having to figure it out and problem solving and getting it done. And I think that is a super important mental adjustment to make. That if you're not occasionally, or actually pretty often, depending on what you're working on, feeling like you don't really know what you're doing, you're probably in the wrong profession. You know what I mean? Like that's a totally normal thing, and you should embrace that feeling of I'm not really sure how to do this. You know, because what you should add to
Exactly.
that when you say that to yourself, you should. It's fine to say I don't know how to do this, but then add, but I'm going to figure it out. And I think that's a huge part of what you do as a developer. Is so don't feel bad if you feel like you don't know what you're doing, because that's where you're supposed to be.
That's where you should be, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the hero's journey for our purposes today is really, I just want us to think about the way that we can visualize and frame like the process that we're going through, and to kind of settle ourselves down as we get into the unknown, because it can be like sometimes the initial reaction is to pull back and be like, all right, I'm not going there. Like I'm just gonna whatever. I'm gonna go, write 94 lines of Twig code that does this thing, even though if I just push, I could get like a three-line module that would be a more elegant solution to the thing. So like, I want us to be comfortable in there, but know that that's an okay place to be. And that's one of the things that we were told when I was writing that book, is that I was there to make sure that the person that was learning was always comfortable and knew where they were, where they came from, and where they were going. And when you're learning on your own, you have to do that for yourself. So it's important to know that in this journey, sometimes you will be in the abyss, but if you persist and get through it, you can come out transformed, and in this case would be learning, having learned something new. All right,
Ryan, I'm a freaking tube worm living off of a volcanic vent deep in the oceanic abyss of development. Like that is me.
That's
living
you?
off.
Yeah,
that is
I think
me.
that's one of the things that I don't want to shower you with too many compliments, because you'll think I'm just going to throw them out every live stream. But I think that's one of the things. That's one of the things I admire about you, though, is that you are comfortable living in that. That's not easy. It takes a lot of practice. So
it helps to be a tube worm.
What book? Oh, it was the 7.5 Lessons on the Brain, where they talk about these organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean that basically, it's kind of like a tube worm where they're basically only focused on like, they're not even thinking like, is food here? Can I smell food or see food? It's basically like, is the current going and it's pushing me this way? And if there is there food there? If not, like it's a very simplified organism. I'm not saying that's what
that's
you are.
me. I'm that simplified organism, Ryan.
So, Andrew, we've talked about we'll probably talk about all this when we get to our practical applications of this. But there's this concept of benchmarking, which is an important tool for learning, especially when you're in that unknown area. Maybe you're in the abyss, and that's it's benchmarking, and it helps you to get some context, to get some like situational awareness of what's going on. And part of that is to look for comparable situations. How are other people teaching the topic that you're learning? If in my case, that's how I work, or solving a similar problem that you're facing. For example, let's say you have to, and we'll keep this try to keep it applied to web technology and craft, but you're trying to solve a problem where you need to hook into an event in craft, but you're not sure like what your next steps are. Well, this is where you could find other plugins. Everybody has their code up on GitHub. You can dive into the code and see how are they using the event. What's their approach? And that's going to help you. It's called benchmarking. It allows you to sort of get draw a line for like, what are the boundaries for how people are working with this technology, with this particular part of the technology. And it helps you gain some context on where you're at and what your next approach could be. Even if it's not the right one, it just helps you get the next steps. And one of the things we're going to talk about today in our examples is directness, so getting as close to the problem as possible. This is really important when it comes to debugging and troubleshooting, removing as many layers of abstraction. You'll see a lot of times when somebody's troubleshooting like a Twig template, someone will ask them, hey, can you just take this block of code and just throw it in a plain old Twig template that has nothing else, so we can isolate to see if there's something else going on. So getting as close to the problem as possible. If you find yourself in the abyss where, let's say, you are extending craft or you're working on a complex implementation and you're not sure if you're still on the right track, step back and simplify and then restate your goal. I do this all the time when I'm building something or writing something. I kind of roll my chair back and think, okay, let me restate my goal of what I'm after, because I think I might have been going down like some side path. So make sure you restate your goal. Make sure you're not adding confusion and complexity. So much of this stuff is like our mind games, but this is our computer. This is our operating system. We have to trick it to do what we want it to do.
Right, and we have to stay focused, Ryan, because we're on craftquest.io. We're not on craftsidequest.io, right? We got to stay focused.
Which may or may not exist. I don't know if you're... All right. And then the last thing I want to talk about is meta learning. So I really like this one because this is what comes out. So in this slide here, where you come out transformed and then you return and you're basically starting the cycle over and over again. One of the outputs that you get from getting into the unknown, getting uncomfortable, is the ability for meta learning. And this is learning how information is structured and acquired in a given topic area. This is learning how to think about extending craft as an example. Like, what are the general approaches for solving, a particular type of problem in our ecosystem? And once you have do that meta learning, you start to understand. You can build a map of like how things work, whether it's in plugin development or site development or just craft in general, how it operates. You can build this like meta map of how the whole thing works. And that helps you then the next time more quickly target a topic and jump in, and you get better and better and better at solving those problems. So you're building. That's
great. I just wanted to add real quick, Ryan. I think that is a really important point, because I think personally that the things that make you a really good developer are not how well you have memorized a given API. Right. They're not how that you know every weird quirk of PHP or JavaScript. It's this meta learning in terms of knowing how to learn, and then also generalizing problems and generalizing approaches. Mm-hmm. And then you can take them to anything, even what seems like a totally different sphere. And I would urge people not to pigeonhole yourself. Don't say, I am a front-end developer. I don't develop PHP, or I don't develop TypeScript, or I don't do this, or I don't do that. I do X. And the reason why I don't think you should do that is I think you're focusing on the tree and not the forest, and you're not focusing on the important skills that you can learn in terms of problem solving that will apply to a number of different disciplines and languages and that type of thing. And it is certainly true that your expertise that you can build up in a specific language, like, it matters that you've never used X before. Certainly that matters. But don't focus on yourself and identify yourself as, I only do this, because then you're not learning the things, or you're not focusing on the things that really make you a good developer and will translate across whatever. And don't be scared to say, yeah, I've never done this before, but let's give it a shot. Yep.
Sean said in the chat that knowing how to search for solutions is one of the most important skills, for sure. And that is people always joke about, the copy pasta, like Google the solution for something, but knowing how to search and the terms to use and how to dig deeper is a learning skill. I mean, it truly is.
And how to rank it SEO is important too.
If you happen to see something where Andrew ranks higher than me, just shoot me an email. Let me know so I can tweak my.
But I want to draw another analogy. So one of the things that I always tell my kids when we're lifting weights is that your body is an amazing machine. Right now you can't lift this weight, but if you keep trying, it's going to be like, okay, you really want me to do this. I will grow and I will be able to do that. And I'm sure you've had analogs in your career as a runner, Ryan, where at some point when you started, you could not run a mile. And then you just, by virtue of doing it, you were able to. Well, your brain is the same way in terms of the things that you learn and the things that you know how to do. It may be kicking and screaming, saying, I'm not comfortable doing this because I don't know how to do it or whatever, but it will learn if you force it. You play this game, if you force your body to do it, and if you go through the exercises you need to do to learn the thing, it will grow and your skill set will grow.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you have to give yourself the opportunity, right? Get below that known line, feel uncomfortable. I know it's not easy, especially when if you're doing a lot of consulting work or client work. I think it really gets really hard because, there's time crunch involved typically. But maybe the learning, if you're not able to do that, maybe the learning happens in a personal project, something where there isn't that time crunch.
And just making sure you set aside some time for learning. Or a trick that I tend to try to use is on any project that I get, I try to just bring in just one new thing that I want to try to learn in that project, if it's applicable. Like, I'm not going to shoehorn it in, but I will try and pull that in. And if that takes me a little bit longer, that's fine. I won't necessarily extend that billing to the client, but it's kind of baked in that I'm going to be learning something while I'm doing this project. So I kind of try to combine the two.
Yep. Yeah, and Cherkushian, if I pronounce that right, learning how to learn is big too. Absolutely. That's actually, speaking of kids, Andrew, that's one of the things that I preach a lot at home is that learning how to learn is the biggest thing. It's not whether you've mastered a certain math thing. It's that you're learning the techniques. That's the difference between in school, in our traditional school here in the US. That's like, if you know how to learn, you can be more successful within our system because you're always getting thrown new things and nobody can master all of them, but you have to learn sort of the framework for how to learn. So that's a good point. That's kind of what I'm after. That's what I want to help people with, and that's what I try to do every day. Andrew, so speaking of the abyss, if anyone has any questions as we're working, let us know. But we want to make sure we keep this practical too for everyone. So, and I have an example in the craft world with some debugging some stuff. Andrew, you recently were in the abyss in some build tooling. You want to talk about what happened to you?
What happened to me? Jeez. You're not going to show me a doll and say, where did they touch you? Like, what are you talking about? What happened to me, Ryan? No. So this is a part of, so a while ago, we did a live stream on Vite, right? So that's that front end build tool. And we easily could have done this kind of exploration on what it took to get that Vite plugin up and running. But I decided that I wanted to get Vite working as something that I could use for the craft websites that I'm building. So I wrote the plugin, got that up and working. We're good to go. But there were a couple of pieces missing. So one thing that was missing was critical CSS. That's something that I generate typically as part of my build process. And I wanted some way that I could do that in this Vite build process that I was doing, right? So this was
what's critical CSS?
Critical CSS is, what it does is it will scrape your page, like your actual page, and it will extract the CSS that appears above the fold, right? So anything that is before people need to scroll, and it will extract that. And what you do is you inline that into your web page. And the reason you do that is you want all of the content above the fold to be able to render without waiting for a style sheet, without waiting for any of these other resources to load. And that's what critical CSS is for. Okay. It's just to make it
actually
quick.
Runs it like headless in Chromium, right? And
yes, it's pretty wild. Yeah, it spins up. There, it's, the turtles go real deep on this one. So it's sitting on basically under the hood. Puppeteer uses headless Chrome, and then this package called Penthouse uses Puppeteer. And then this package called Critical uses Penthouse. And now you could just call this Critical. This is a Node.js package. You could just call this yourself, but it's a little more convenient to just have one build process. It'd be nice if I could do this all inside of Vite. So I decided to look into what it would take to do this. Now, I have never written a rollup plugin before. That's not a thing that I have done.
So you were getting into the unknown.
I was getting deeply into the unknown.
I mean, did you think about like just not doing this? Like, were you just like, this is going to be a total pain. I'm not going to do it.
No, it actually never crossed my mind. What did cross my mind was more like, when am I going to do this? Because we're engineers, right? So we want to automate things, and I didn't want it to be some janky solution, So the first thing I did was I said, okay, well, let's take a look at the rollup documentation and let's see what they have to say about making a plugin, right? And, I kind of paged through it, and I got the general idea of what it does and all that kind of good stuff. And so that's where I started. And I said, okay, this is not so bad. Let's take a look at what it might actually look like to do this. So then what I did is I poked around and I went to the awesome Vite, which is a repository that has a whole bunch of example plugins. Now, understand
so it sounds
that
like you were doing some benchmarking here, right? You were trying to find how other people did something similar.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to get the lay of the land. I mean, it reminds me again, to get back to the adventuring analogy. There was a time that my brother and I took off for Costa Rica, and we had no plans. We had no plans at all. And we were there. We had allocated a month that we're going to be there. And what we did is we just landed and we started talking to people. Say, hey, what's cool here? What should we check out? That kind of thing. So that's kind of what I was doing here. And I was looking at these different plugins that other people made. And I looked at some, and because it's open source software, you're going to have, let's just say, varying degrees of quality in terms of what people have done, right? And also lots of different approaches, but it still was interesting. So what I did at first was I would just look at a number of these different things. I would look at things that looked kind of similar to what I was trying to do. Like there's no point in me looking at a React JSX plugin, although there might be some commonalities. Probably I should look at something a little more similar. And I just looked at a bunch of them kind of to see how they worked. And then the other thing that I did is Vite plugins are actually all roll-up plugins. So they use the same API. And then what I also did is I checked out the awesome roll-up repo and just started looking at some code that some other people had written. And
so what you're saying is that you didn't just open up your IDE and start just writing code quickly like they do in the movies and have it all done?
Well, I wouldn't know what the hell to write, right? I'd have an editor open, but what am I going to put in there, And that's the other thing is, the documentation, they do document how it works, and they do provide, quote unquote, a simple example. But I personally, and this may be different for you, but I personally learn better by reverse engineering and taking apart something that other people have done. And the reason I look at a number of them is there are so many different approaches. I want to look at a whole bunch of different approaches and see what is the commonality and what should I be looking at. And this is something that you and I actually talked about. The funny thing is the actual resulting code from this spelunking and the actual plugin that I wrote is not very impressive, right? There's just not a ton there. But the amount of research and work that it takes to get it to that refined, smaller thing definitely did take a little bit of work. So why don't we?
I recently spent a couple hours diving into some code to figure something out, only for it to result in a single line of code for my own.
But I think that's a huge win, right? I think that's amazing. I think that's really cool. All right, so why don't we dive into, and if anyone, while I'm going over this stuff, if anyone has any questions in chat, please ask them, right?
Yeah.
So again, rollup is something that I had never done before, written a plugin for them, for rollup. And there were a couple of other things. I knew that if I was writing a library, I would want to write it in TypeScript. And one of the reasons is that, and we did a show on TypeScript, so I'm not going to go into the whole spiel on it here, But one of the reasons why is it will kind of lint your code before you even run it, which is really nice. And then the other thing is you can see as I'm mousing over here that I'm actually in the vite.config.js for a site. And this is where it's instantiating my critical plugin. And it gives you this nice autocomplete right over this. So I wanted this for people that were using my plugin. I wanted them to be able to have all this nice documentation on the fields and all that kind of stuff that's in there. So I'd never written and published a TypeScript library before. So that was another new kind of thing to me. And another thing that I knew that I should be doing if I'm writing a library is I should be doing testing. So I had done some testing before on JavaScript when I had contributed to some other open source libraries. You know, like I did all this work and I contributed a pull request and they're like, oh, that's great. Can you write some tests on it? I'm like, yeah, sure.
Back into the unknown.
Yeah. But this is the code for the actual plugin, and we're going to go over what is in there real quick. But I did add testing in here as well as part of the stuff that I wrote. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what a rollup plugin is. So ultimately, a rollup plugin, you're just exporting a function, right? So here is our function, and these are the parameters that it takes. So these I can decide whatever parameters I want these to be. This is what other people pass into me here, right? So this is someone consuming my plugin is passing in this config, and this is where I say, okay, here's my config that I'm getting in the function. And Ryan, while I'm going through this, if you have any questions, please let me know.
Okay.
It says, why is Andrew using a filter for screen sharing? I am not using a filter. I don't know why. He says it seems dark. Antonio says, can you read it,
just
Ryan?
your editor? I mean, it's probably maybe not as bright as what I share, but
I see. All right. Well, sorry. Make it bigger. I don't know if that helps. But anyway, so that's what we have here. This is every plugin for rollup, and when I say rollup, I'm also saying Vite because it uses the same plugin architecture. I think they wanted to leverage the same architecture. So here's our function. And you could have nothing that is passed in, right? It could just be a plugin that takes no parameters, but I've got a config object that you can pass in. And then it returns a plugin. And this is a type that you import from rollup. And this makes sure that it conforms to the spec of a plugin. This is a TypeScript thing where it's going to say it must be of this type. So it must have these various properties in it. And all it does is it returns an object. And this object has some key value pairs. It's got a name, right? And then there are a couple of other key value pairs that you can optionally have. But then the way that it works is you pick, here we go, build hooks, yeah. So basically what you do is in addition to a name key value pair, rollup has a number of hooks that are called in the process of building stuff, right? And so you have to kind of look through the documentation, look through examples and say, okay, where should I hook in? Like if you wanted to do something when the build had ended, you would hook into build end. If you wanted to do something when the build started, you would hook into build start, that kind of thing. So that's what we're doing here. So after doing a little research, I found that what the hook that I wanted to hook into was called write bundle. And the reason I wanted to hook into that is it happens right after the bundle is written out to disk. The bundle being all of the transformed JavaScript and CSS and all that kind of good stuff, right? So that's what I hooked into here. And all I'm doing, I'm not going to go over it in super detail, but basically what I'm doing is I'm passed in this this bundle, which has a whole bunch of stuff in it in terms of all of the resources that have been bundled up by rollup. And what I do is I loop through them and I look for anything that's an asset and is a CSS file. And then I add it to my array. So I want to keep, I'm keeping track of all of the CSS that was generated by this build, right? And then what I'm doing is I'm iterating through this setting that was passed into my config. So one of the things that I have that I'm passing in are critical pages, and it's an object that has a URI and a template. The URI is where it's going to pull the critical CSS from, like what pages it's going to render headlessly. And then the template is basically just saying, what should this be written out as? The CSS, after we've extracted it, how should it be written out? So I'm looping through those and essentially just glomming together. So I'm putting together a object that contains the CSS that we extracted from the build, and then also has the default critical config, so a default critical CSS config that we pass in, which is defined right here. And then any of the, and then I'm mixing in the critical base, the critical source, and the target, and these are all computed from the critical pages we're iterating through. And then any config that you pass in. So let's say you wanted to overwrite, something that is in the settings that are passed on to critical. You can do that by passing it in the critical config here, right there, right? And then, I don't know why it keeps doing that. Sorry, everybody, for getting nauseous. But then all I do is I take that amalgamated config and I pass it down to critical, this package from Adi Esmani that, as I said, critical calls Penthouse, Penthouse calls Puppeteer, Puppeteer renders this in a headless Chrome on your local dev environment. So that's really like all my plugin really does is it taps in at the right place and it prepares some config, and then it passes it off to this other package that's there. And that's what a lot of Webpack plugins do, and rollup plugins. Go ahead, Ron.
How much of your work on this was kind of getting oriented with like how things work, like versus writing the actual code?
I would say the majority of it was getting oriented, for sure. And the other, ironically, the other things that took time were, again, I decided I wanted to do it in TypeScript. So in order to, actually doing these, I did these type definitions. So this is all me basically copying and pasting from the documentation. And I did this so that in your code, you would have this autocomplete that I showed before, where like when you hover over a property, it will tell you the documentation. So you don't have to look it up, So it didn't take too long to copy and paste that stuff, but it did take a little while to figure out the proper way to then bundle up and generate these types to distribute it as a bundle, as a library bundle. And that's something that, I just never had done before. So it took a little while there, and there were a whole bunch of different approaches. I went through 4 or 5 different approaches before I settled at the one that I'm using in this plugin.
Right.
And the other thing that took time was figuring out how to do the tests. So I did implement a number of tests in here because I wanted to make sure that that the plugin was robust and that it was doing its thing. So if we're here, for instance, you can do make test. And I did it where it's going to spin up a Docker container, but it will actually run the tests that I wrote, and it will spit out a coverage report in terms of how much of the code does your test actually cover, because it actually will trace the execution path. And this is using Jest. Previous to this, I had used Mocha and Chai, which are 2 other, JavaScript testing libraries.
I need to form a committee on naming. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. But in any event, so what it's doing here is it's running these tests. And then the other thing this is funny. So a lot of the meta work around this took time. The other thing that took time was I wanted this coverage stuff to be run as part of the CI process, right? So I did some GitHub actions that would actually execute this on every push. So it would make sure that it ran all of this. But you can see it's running the test pass. Right, you can see that up here, and then this is the coverage. This is the percent of statements that were covered by the test, what percentage of functions. So what it's saying is the test that I wrote, there are some conditionals inside of the code that it didn't hit, but it's got 91% coverage, which is pretty good. But that's what took a lot of the time, really.
Are you more of a Like when you're trying to figure out like or struggle with a part of doing this work, are you more of a someone who learns or not learns, who solves a problem by like kind of simmering? Like I know you like to go on hikes on, you know, on trails around where you live. Is that where you typically try to shake out some of your harder problems, or do you just like to just kind of force
I
those
would
solutions
say,
to come on the keyboard?
well, I would say that type of thing, like the things I think about when I'm hiking or I'm doing that kind of thing, it's more architectural decisions or higher level thinking. It's not really how do I solve this particular coding problem, because it helps to have the feedback loop. So for me, it's more the architectural decisions or the higher level, like how should I approach this kind of thing that I figure out when I'm doing those kind of hiking things, you know?
Not actual like a detailed problem, because I guess that requires like trying things and running the code and then seeing. But sometimes you realize that maybe you're trying to solve something at a lower level when you realize that it's actually it's an approach issue. You're on the runway, but you realize that you actually missed the runway because you weren't lined up properly versus like something else.
Yeah. Well, so, you know, I realized that a roll-up plugin, a lot of people who are watching this might be like, well, I'm never going to write one of those. Like, who cares? You know what I mean? But I didn't set out to want to write a roll-up plugin,
Right.
I had a problem. I wanted to have this thing working in Vite because Vite has a really nice experience for me. And that's how I got down this road and decided that I needed to try and, you know, kind of figure out what was going on. And I also think it does demonstrate the getting out of my comfort zone pretty well, you know, where you really are having to try something that you've just never done before, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a good example. Ben Croker says hiking is like mental digestion. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not like, you know, it's not like you're going to solve the specifics of like how to do a test in Jest. It's not like you're going to figure that out on a hike, right? Because you need the feedback loop of the thing that you're doing in order to be able to do that. But I think this is an interesting sidetrack in that I didn't at any point say, I've never done this before, so I'm just not going to do it, or I'm going to look for some other way to do it. You know, I said, all right, well, how hard can it be? And I'm just like, let's give it a shot. You know, how hard could it be? And I have almost never found that things are as hard as I think they're going to be. You know, once you get into it a little bit and you start, oh, okay, that's all they're doing. Oh, okay. You know what I mean? It almost never ends up being that bad.
Well, I mean, it's becoming comfortable with discomfort as well, and just kind of maybe reveling in that a little bit. Just
what are you saying, Ryan?
well, I mean, so as an example, you know, we've talked about doing like live streams where we're kind of coding things and discovering things like on the air live. And as someone that teaches and puts a lot of prep into teaching things, that's like a real uncomfortable place to be, sort of like live. But like if you're in there and you start to become more comfortable with that, then you can spend more time in that below the known line into the unknown area and just kind of be comfortable with it. It's there's a I don't remember who said it, and I don't remember the exact quote, but it's around running, where somebody said that like I forget the quote, something like the real blessing comes in the edges. And that means basically like when you're running and you're pushing yourself like in the edges, whatever those are for you, is like that's where all the growth comes, is when you're in that uncomfortable spot, when you're
I don't know, Ryan. I think the edges for me, what came were rashes and stuff. Like whenever you get that running and the chafing. Edges are just no good when it comes to running. I get what you're saying. I just realized we didn't do a critical part of this thing. We never showed any people that this thing actually works. So let me just show actually running this and doing.
We don't want to think that your work doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you never know, right? All right, so let me get back. All right, so I'm back in here. Okay, so this is our code, right? So we went over, you know, pretty much what this is, and it's a glorified pull out the CSS that was generated, put the config object together, and then call someone else who did the hard stuff to do the work for us. I mean, that's really what it boils down to, that this thing does. But a lot of plugins that are available for Webpack and for Rollup and for other things, this is very common. It's very common that this ends up being the case. But let's take a look at, whoa, that's the wrong one. All right, so let's take a look at the actual project that I have here. So here we go. This is my plugin dev development environment. I've got an article on this on my site if you want to look at it. But basically, everything is running in Docker containers. So Vite is running over here. Everything's running live. But I can just do make build. And what this is going to do is it's going to run. Actually, you know what? Let's not have any secrets. So in our make file, when we type make build, what it's going to do is it makes sure that the containers are up and running. And then inside of our build chain container, it's going to do npm run build. Right? So that's what is going on down here. And you can see it Vite built our legacy CSS and JavaScript here. I'm sorry, our legacy JavaScript here. And then this little line here, this is coming from my plugin. So it says generating critical CSS from this URL to this, and that's where it's writing it out. And then down below it, these are the regular bundle that was done, including the CSS, like the full site CSS. Now, so if we take a look at our Vite config, like this makes sense, because we said we want you to get the critical CSS from here, and we want you to write it out to here, which is the current directory. And this is the current directory. This is where it wrote it out. So here's the critical CSS that it extracted out.
There we go.
Bing, bada boom. It works. All right. I feel better now. We showed people that it actually works.
All right. I like that example, Andrew, from you, since and this is a good topic, because to me, like, I feel, at least from here, down here in rainy, thunderstormy Austin, Texas, is that you spend a lot of time in the unknown area, which I think is interesting. And it's a good way to, it's certainly a good way to do interesting work and expand, and not just rehash the same thing over and over again, for sure. I wanted to get to,
and that's the real point, right? The real point is, it doesn't matter if you think you're never in your life going to write a roll-up plugin. That's fine, right? It doesn't. This example is not about that. This example is approaching something I haven't seen before, how I approach it to try and solve the problem and build the thing, and the fact that I didn't just try to build the minimal thing. I decided to try to figure out how to do it right from the point of view of bundling up the TypeScript, writing it in TypeScript to begin with, making sure that I added tests that went along the way. And those things that I learned in doing that are going to be very applicable to other stuff that I do in the future. So I didn't try to do an MVP of this. I tried to do it, quote unquote, right, not just to get this library working right, but also so that I would know the best practices to do it going forward, if that makes sense.
And there's some a good back and forth in the chat about kind of getting, digging in deep, and then maybe realizing that, you're too far, or you've lost context of where you are. And the idea is if you go in deep and then you realize I don't, you have to kind of back out and then redraw your map. Like, okay, I have to kind of go up a layer before I, dig deeper. And that way you're actually approaching it with knowing what you're doing. It's really important that this isn't just like a method for getting something done. It really is. The idea is to understand what you're doing. And you're not always you might not know how do events work behind the scenes in Craft in Yi. Like, you might not know that when you first work with an event, let's say in a module, just as a real simple example. But eventually you might have to then start to learn how they work. Or with there was some discussion in Discord about setting up a something with the queue service, and so you might not know how it all works, but eventually you're probably going to have to unearth that and figure it out. So this is really good. And if you realize that you're missing something, then you just back out and you redraw your map to make sure that you understand that, and then you can jump back down. Otherwise, you'll just start to spin your wheels because you'll be trying things without understanding that, like, I can't use like this method here because of XYZ or something like that. And
yeah, Ryan, you're Lewis and Clark. You're out there. You find this big swamp and it's filled with alligators, right? You don't go, hey, let's try and walk through this thing. This sounds like a great idea. No, you go back and you go around and you see if there isn't a better way to get through this thing, right?
Yeah, you thought you were in Missouri, but you actually are in Florida, which is a completely different place.
And then you write a little map and you put a little thing on the map that says "There be the alligators," right? So that other people don't have to go through that too. Yeah.
Exactly. And I want to do a whole series on this, Andrew, but I do want to highlight, like, in terms of like wayfinding or understanding like where you're at, especially where you're at in terms of the craft application runtime, like what's happening. So this is PHP Storm, which if you're doing any plugin development, you should definitely be using, I think. But so I have, I'm running Nitro, and I have Xdebug turned on, and that's really just by running Nitro X on is really all there is to it. And there's some configuration inside of PHP Storm, which we won't talk about here, but it's in the docs, and I'll cover it. Or maybe we'll do it on a live stream, we'll see. But anyway, this is a nice way of understanding like where you're at. If you're saying like, why isn't this thing acting the way I think? Why doesn't this variable contain the data that I think it contains? Or what is happening? I understand. This is like basic like debugging 101. If you have a good tool like Xdebug set up where you can just set a breakpoint in the code, I'll just set it here. And maybe I want to understand like what this error message is, like when it runs exception get message, what it's assigning to the error variable. You can do that, and then you can run the code. I actually realized I didn't set up an example here to run the code, so hang on. 1 second.
Got to be able to run the code, Ryan.
Yeah. Okay, so here we go. So I'm just going to, so this example right here is I'm running some, the payment form on the site, and I'm just gonna, you can't see it. It's just off to a different screen. All right, so I'm gonna run the code, and I have Xdebug is running, and I set the breakpoint. And so when it gets to that point, you see where it went green, and I'm just gonna move this up a little bit. And now I have this debug output here, and I can actually go through and see, what error is. I can look through the variables here. Not sure why it's null, but you can go into the console and you can just look at error as well, which happens to be null for some reason, which is interesting. Oh, it didn't get assigned, right? Because it broke here. So if I did exception get message, then it would output the message. And so you can start to see, like, look, at this point in the runtime of the application, this is, I was trying to troubleshoot why an error message was what it was, and I couldn't figure out. So I just dropped some breakpoints and stepped through. And the cool thing about using Xdebug, and I'm preaching to the choir with you, Andrew, is the ability to step over lines of code, step into like a for loop or a function. But one of my favorites is step to the run to the cursor, because then you can be more selective about running into, in this case, it's an exception, so I'm not really going to get anywhere.
Everything is about running with you.
So you can then run to the cursor and then start to more selectively choose where you want to stop the application next to understand what's going on. So I'm going to do this isn't supposed to be a primer on this, but the idea is that this helps you wayfind and kind of build this map of what's happening in the application and where things are getting called, what's being returned. And so you're not working in the dark, especially when you're extending craft with a plugin or a module, you know, when you start out, you will run into these things where you don't know what's happening. You use a tool like Xdebug. You know, var dump or dump and die is another way of doing it. This is just a little bit more precise, and it doesn't require so many like iterations of the application over and over again.
I want your course on Xdebug, Ryan.
Yeah. It's on the list. It's on the roadmap. CraftQuest.io/roadmap. Actually, I don't know if it's on there, but we'll put it there.
Yeah, anything named Quest definitely needs to have a roadmap. So I'm glad to hear that you have one.
Yeah, I do have one. Yeah. Anything else to add, Andrew? We're at an hour. I know you're speaking later today.
Yeah, I'm good. That's not for another 45 minutes. So, I mean, if you got more to present, you got more to present.
What conference are you speaking at? Jamstack Montreal? No.
That's who's hosting it, but he's calling it something else. I should know this. This is so bad.
All right, sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh no.
I was gonna say if it didn't require like registration, if people wanted to chime in, I think it meant.
No, it doesn't require registration. It's the Click Deploy Conference, is what Henri is calling it. And there's some very smart people that are giving talks there, not including me. So, Wes Boss is there, and Kyle Matthews, the founder of Gatsby, and there's a whole bunch of people giving some really cool Jamstack-oriented-ish talks, and somehow they snuck me in there. But yeah, if you want to check it out, you can find Jamstack Toronto on Twitter, or if you go to the NY Studio 107 Twitter account, I retweeted something about it yesterday or the day before or something like that. But getting back to what we're talking about here, again, I think a lot of this is just getting yourself in the right mental frame. And don't get me wrong, like, trust me, I get annoyed and irritated all the time. You know what I mean? In terms of like, oh,
with me or just okay.
Well, just in general, but sometimes with, you know, code or something not working, and it's just very frustrating. And when you're frustrated, that's fine. Just walk away. But so I'm not trying to paint the picture that I'm just this, you know, Zen serene and, you know, everything will work out in the end. Sorry, Ben, but that's just not me. But I think it's normal. You have to just embrace the fact that you're going to feel confused. You're going to feel lost. And that the real gain is that little rush of adrenaline or dopamine or whatever kind of drug your body releases when you figure it out and you get it working. And also think about it from the long game perspective, the same way you would any kind of exercise or weight training or running or whatever, that you're going to make yourself better by virtue of just the journey that you go on, just the fact that you do it, the fact that you put in the time on a consistent basis, pushing the envelope a little bit of what you know, that's what makes you grow. If you don't put in the time, you're not going to grow. It's
the transformation. It's the end of the hero's journey. And that's where, that's what it's all about.
Otherwise, you're just going to stay like, you know, one of those tube worms. You're just going to stay kind of wiggling in the vent down underneath the abyss. Because if you go to the abyss, the idea is ultimately you want to be transformed and you want to emerge stronger, right? And you get your vengeance or, you know, whatever it ends up being. But you do have to go through the fire for that to happen.
Yeah. And practically speaking, for like technology, things move and change so quickly that this is a skill that you have to have, right? Like you don't want to let your knowledge of the space get too far behind because things are changing quickly. So it's good it's good to know how to be a good learner, know how to learn.
Yeah, for sure. And you're right that it is just going to be a constant thing. You know, people talk about, well, you know, we'll eventually get JavaScript to the point that this will be. No, it never ends. Okay. You're always going to be pushing it further. And you just have to know that that's the deal, you know, that, you know, and if you're not okay with that, maybe there are other professions.
But I mean,
real talk, Ryan, real talk. Like you have to at least know that that's going to be a thing.
There's discomfort at everything, you know, sure, that you do, and it's all obviously relative. But yeah, but at least in our space, I think you have to, it's important to become comfortable. And I say this as like a mantra to myself, is to be comfortable with, being in that unknown area, having that discomfort. I'm sure there's some like Zen Buddhism thing we could get into about, sort of reveling in the discomfort and stuff like that, but we won't. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up, and I
got something to add real quick before we wrap up, before you do your own. So the other thing that I think is important about this learning process is, and a lot of people are worried about this, and don't be, is put your code out there for other people to look at. Put it in a Git repo, share it with people, let people look at it, because then you can leverage Cunningham's law. Do you know what Cunningham's law of the internet is, Ryan?
I don't. Is it from a TV show? But go ahead.
No, it's a real thing. So Cunningham's law states that the best way to get a right answer on the internet is to post the wrong answer. Right? So the best way to get an answer is not to ask a question, but it is to post the wrong answer. So the reason that's relevant is you really do get the benefit of other people looking at your code, and they may have some improvements for you or some things that you could make better. Right. And so that happened with me when I was bundling up these TypeScript types. Like I had tried one method, and then in a channel on TypeScript, I said, is this the case? Is the way to do things? And someone showed me another way to do it. And then someone showed me another way. And then I found, you know what I mean? Like, understand that you're going to improve, and you can almost think about putting your code out there as bait. You know what I mean? Like if your code isn't right, someone is going to obey Cunningham's law and tell you, this is how you could make it better. And then you don't feel bad about that. You're like, sweet, someone just gave me free consulting. Like this is a free mentorship. This is awesome. You know? And
you see it all the time in Discord and on Stack Exchange, at least in our community here, but with all tech. I mean, and I think some people go about it nicer than others, but in our community, I feel like it's. I've literally on Stack Exchange, on the Craft CMS Stack Exchange, seen people like give complete answers to like complete in as that they wrote like a bunch of code to help someone solve something, and or help them adjust their code to make it work better, or gave feedback on you should change this. So that's Cunningham's law. There we are.
Yeah, wrong answers only. It's like when someone does a tweet and says, what's the best way to do your job? Wrong answers only. It's kind of like that. You know what I mean? You take your code and you put it up there, and it may not be the best, but that's fine. Like that's people that do know what they're doing on this one particular area. And again, the reason they know what they're doing on this area is because they have made this mistake before. It's not because they were born with some God-given talent in doing the thing. All it means is they've made the mistake before. They're going to be happy. They're going to be overjoyed to be able to point out to you how you could do it better. And you should take that as free mentorship. Like it's a fantastic thing.
Yep. So if you want to put into practice.
Joe Tuna says, I constantly post boneheaded questions to get info from Andrew. Now, the right way to do it. The right way to do it. Yeah, but the right way to do it is not to pose questions. It's to post code that's just blatantly wrong. Because then someone's going to go in there and they're like, no, don't do it like that.
Right. All right. So if just to wrap up, if you want to take some of what we've talked about, and there's been a lot of great discussion in chat, and I think that we're like, nobody's different in this. We're all working harder to be more comfortable in the unknown area. But in the craft space, if you want to try out something, there is the Quest that has a series of courses. This is the Extending Craft CMS Quest on Extending Craft, and these were made to are focused on that first step of extending craft. So getting into that uncomfortable area if you haven't extended craft yet with a module or a plugin, or adding a CMS, like a dashboard widget. Creating a Twig filter is a great one to start with. And then Ben Croker, who is in the chat, has a couple of courses on plugin development. There's one in depth, and then there is one getting started with plugin development, which is a mini course that Ben did. where he walks through the fundamentals. And that's a great way of building a map, right? Of understanding like, oh, this is the lay of the land for how plugin development works. These are how the different pieces are. Ben has a great diagram he created of the different parts of a plugin, so you can understand those different parts. One thing you'll notice if you've watched a lot of my courses is that I always have a section in a course called the pieces of whatever the thing I'm teaching. And the idea is to kind of set it up as like, here are the different things, and it helps you build the map of like, oh, okay, these things together make up this thing that I'm learning. So now I can jump into each one and understand contextually like where I'm at. So check out the quest for extending Craft CMS if you want to learn more. Check out Andrew, I believe in the chat. I thought Ben was going to post the. Did he post the link? It didn't come through on my thing.
I posted the link. So I posted the link to the tweet, and also it's click-deployconf.ca.
Great.
But
you'll be on in about an hour or so, right? Something like that.
Well, it's like a little less. Okay. Yeah, half hour. But don't come for me because they're going to be way better speakers there. It looks like a really good lineup.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Andrew. Good episode. Thanks everyone for the discussion in the chat. I know this is something we all do every day. The struggle is real. So we will see you all in the next live stream. We stream the first and third Thursday of the month. So we'll be back in 2 weeks. And then not again until
Dates
July.
Are hard, Ryan. Yeah, dates are hard, aren't they? Yeah.
I created calendar invites this time, so I didn't mess it up. In the meantime, check out Andrew's stuff at nystudio107.com. Check out craftquest.io. If you enjoy the videos and not a subscriber, premium subscriptions are available for both individuals and teams. Encourage you to check that out as well. Andrew, thank you as always.
You're welcome, Ryan.
We'll see you all in the next live stream. Take care.
Bye-bye.